Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the American South. Before we begin, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is. In the spring of 1847, in the fertile cotton country of central Georgia, the Ashford family's Riverside plantation stood as a monument to wealth and respectability, its grand columns rising above fields worked by more than 60 enslaved people. On an April evening that year, 15-year-old Samuel, who served as a houseboy in the main residence, returned to his sparse quarters in the dependency building to discover something that defied every rule of the rigid social order that governed plantation life. Sitting on his narrow bed in the dim candlelight was Margaret Ashford, the master's 28-year-old wife, her expensive silk gown rustling softly as she turned to face him, with an expression that held neither anger nor authority. The small room, measuring barely 10 feet square, with whitewashed walls and a single window overlooking the kitchen garden, had never before received such a visitor, and the transgression of boundaries was so complete, so incomprehensible, that Samuel stood frozen in the doorway, unable to speak or move. According to testimony that would surface nearly a century later in documents discovered by researchers, Samuel's first instinct was terror, the bone-deep fear that he had somehow committed an offense simply by returning to his own quarters, that he would be blamed for this impossible situation in which he found himself. The dependency building, situated 50 yards behind the main house and connected by a covered walkway, housed 6 enslaved people who worked in the household, and at that moment Samuel could hear the distant voices of the others in their rooms, unaware that in his small space the entire architecture of plantation hierarchy was collapsing in ways that would have consequences none of them could yet imagine. What happened in that small room on that April evening would remain hidden for nearly a century, buried beneath layers of silence and the deliberate erasure that characterized so many dark secrets of the antebellum South, until a remarkable discovery in the summer of 1943 began to pull back the veil on this disturbing chapter of Riverside Plantation's history. A graduate student from the University of Georgia, conducting research on domestic management practices in antebellum households, discovered a leather-bound ledger in the attic of what had once been the Ashford estate, a meticulous record kept by Judith Crawford, the head housekeeper at Riverside, from 1845 to 1850. The ledger, filled with neat columns documenting household supplies, staff assignments, and daily routines, contained something far more significant, hidden within its mundane entries, cryptic notations about Mrs. Ashford's movements that began appearing in March 1847. The entries were carefully worded, written in a hand that betrayed both loyalty to duty and profound unease, with phrases such as "mistress absent from chambers, 9 o'clock evening," and "mistress to dependencies, purpose unstated," appearing with disturbing regularity throughout the spring months. By cross-referencing these notations with other dated entries in the ledger, historians determined that Margaret's visits to the dependency building occurred approximately 3 to 4 times each week, always in the evening hours after the master had retired to his study with his customary bottle of brandy. The pattern was unmistakable, and Mrs. Crawford's increasingly terse notations suggested a woman who understood she was documenting something profoundly wrong, but who lacked any power to intervene or report what she observed. One entry from late April simply read, "God forgive us all for what we permit in silence," a statement that carried the weight of collective complicity in a system where even free white servants understood that challenging the actions of their employers could result in immediate dismissal and destitution. The marriage that had brought Margaret to Riverside Plantation in 1835 was, by the standards of wealthy Southern families, entirely conventional, arranged between Thomas Ashford, a prosperous cotton planter already established in Burke County society, and the 16-year-old daughter of a declining Charleston mercantile family, desperate to secure their daughter's future through an advantageous match. Thomas, then 31 years old and recently widowed after his first wife died in childbirth, possessed everything that made a man desirable in the eyes of Charleston society. 3,000 acres of prime cotton land, a Greek revival mansion that rivaled any in the county, and the social standing that came from a family name respected throughout Georgia's planter class. Letters discovered in 1958 in the Charleston Historical Society archives, written by Margaret to her younger sister Catherine between 1836 and 1846, paint a portrait of profound isolation and unhappiness that deepened with each passing year at Riverside. In an 1838 letter, Margaret described her husband as cold in manner and interested only in his cotton yields and his standing among the other planters, noting that he spent his evenings in his study reviewing account books and rarely spoke to her beyond basic courtesies. By 1842, her letters had taken on a tone of quiet desperation, with one particularly revealing passage stating that she felt herself more ornament than wife, displayed at social functions but otherwise forgotten, living in a house filled with people yet utterly alone. The remoteness of Riverside, situated 7 miles from the nearest neighboring plantation and 12 miles from the small town of Waynesboro, compounded Margaret's isolation, as she had no close companions, and her requests to visit her family in Charleston were frequently denied by Thomas, who considered such trips frivolous expenses and disruptions to household routine. The letters reveal a woman slowly suffocating under the weight of a loveless marriage, trapped in a world where she possessed status but no autonomy, comfort but no affection. The true horror of what transpired in that dependency building became devastatingly clear through an extraordinary archaeological discovery made in 1974, when researchers from Georgia State University, conducting excavations at the site of the former Riverside plantation, unearthed a small wooden box buried beneath what had once been the floor of the quarters adjacent to Samuel's room. Inside the box, preserved by the remarkably dry conditions of the sandy Georgia soil, was a fragmentary diary kept by a woman named Rachel, who served as a seamstress in the Ashford household, and whose room shared a thin wall with Samuel's quarters. The diary, written in crude but legible script on pages torn from discarded household ledgers, contained entries from April and May of 1847 that documented Rachel's growing awareness of what was happening to the young man she referred to as like a brother to me in this place of sorrows. In an entry dated April 28th, Rachel wrote that Samuel had appeared at her door after midnight, trembling and unable to speak, and when she finally coaxed words from him, he told her only that she comes and I cannot stop her, and if master finds out he will kill me, and if I refuse her she will have me killed, and there is no path that does not end in my death. The diary reveals Samuel's complete powerlessness in a situation where every possible action led to destruction. He could not refuse Margaret without facing her wrath and the inevitable accusation that he had assaulted her, could not report the situation to Thomas Ashford without being executed for the crime of being his wife's victim, and could not flee without being hunted down as a runaway and subjected to brutal punishment. Rachel's entries convey her own helplessness as she watched Samuel deteriorate over the following weeks, noting that he no longer sleeps and barely eats, and I see death in his eyes though he still draws breath. The most disturbing evidence of what occurred at Riverside Plantation came from Margaret Ashford's own hand, discovered alongside the housekeeper's ledger in that same attic trunk in 1943, a leather-bound journal with a brass clasp that contained entries spanning from January 1847 to February 1848. The journal, authenticated by handwriting experts and corroborated by details that matched other historical records, revealed a woman whose profound loneliness and desperation had twisted into something far darker, entries that framed her actions through a lens of romantic delusion while demonstrating a complete inability or unwillingness to recognize the fundamental coercion embedded in every interaction. In an entry from April 1847, Margaret wrote that she had found solace in the company of one who listens without judgment and whose presence brings comfort in this cold house, describing Samuel as gentle and kind, with eyes that hold understanding beyond his years. The language throughout the journal employed the conventions of romantic literature popular in that era, with Margaret casting herself as a tragic heroine and Samuel as a willing companion in her loneliness, never once acknowledging the reality that he possessed no power to refuse her, that his presence in those midnight encounters was not choice, but captivity. The journal entries revealed Margaret's awareness that discovery would mean Samuel's death, yet this knowledge did not deter her visits, but rather seemed to add an element of forbidden romance to her narrative, as she wrote in May that the danger makes our meetings all the more precious, though I know the world would not understand what we share. Historians examining these documents have noted the chilling disconnect between Margaret's self-perception and the brutal reality of plantation power structures where an enslaved teenager could be compelled to endure anything his owner or his owner's family demanded, where his body was not his own, and where the slightest resistance would result in torture or death. The enslaved community surrounding Riverside Plantation understood what was happening long before any white person acknowledged the situation, their knowledge traveling through the invisible networks of communication that connected the quarters of neighboring estates, whispered conversations at Sunday gatherings, and the coded language that allowed the oppressed to share vital information while maintaining the appearance of ignorance before their enslavers. In 1937, as part of the Federal Writers' Project that collected narratives from formerly enslaved people, an interviewer in Atlanta recorded the testimony of Esther Williams, who was 91 years old at the time and had spent her childhood on Magnolia Grove Plantation, located just 4 miles from Riverside. Mrs. Williams, whose memory remained remarkably clear despite her advanced age, recalled the spring and summer of 1847 with disturbing specificity, stating that folks knew something terrible wrong was happening at the Ashford place, whispers about the mistress and a young houseboy. But nobody could say nothing out loud because that would mean death for sure. The narrative reveals that Samuel's situation was discussed among the enslaved workers who traveled between plantations on errands, at clandestine religious gatherings in the woods, and during brief encounters at the mill or the crossroads store. But this knowledge came with the understanding that any attempt to intervene or expose the situation would result in brutal retaliation, not just against the speaker, but against entire families. Mrs. Williams recounted that her own mother, who worked as a laundress and sometimes took in washing from Riverside, had returned from a delivery in May 1847, deeply troubled, saying only that boy's eyes look like someone already dead, and there ain't nothing nobody can do because the white folks' evil is a trap with no escape. The narrative conveys the profound moral anguish of a community forced to witness an atrocity while understanding that their own powerlessness made them unwilling participants in the silence that allowed it to continue. Thomas Ashford's awareness of something amiss in his household began to surface in the historical record through a business letter discovered in 2003 among the papers of a Savannah cotton factor's office, a communication dated July 15, 1847, that discussed market conditions and shipping arrangements before concluding with a brief but revealing personal observation. The letter, written in Thomas's characteristically terse style that favored business matters over personal revelation, noted that domestic irregularities have arisen which require my attention, matters of a delicate nature involving Mrs. Ashford's comportment that I find myself at a loss to properly address. Thomas went on to explain that he was considering sending Margaret to stay with her sister's family in Charleston for an extended period, stating that the isolation of plantation life seems to have affected her nerves, and perhaps the society of her own kin and the diversions of the city might restore her to a more settled disposition. The phrasing suggests a man who had observed changes in his wife's behavior, noted her evening absences from the main house, or perhaps received hints from servants too frightened to speak directly, but whose understanding was constrained by the rigid categories of thought available to men of his class and era. The idea that his wife might be compelling a 15-year-old enslaved boy into a relationship would have been, for Thomas, quite literally unthinkable, a violation so extreme that his mind would reject it even when confronted with evidence, choosing instead to interpret Margaret's behavior through more acceptable frameworks, such as nervous disorder or feminine hysteria. The letter reveals Thomas standing at the edge of a terrible truth, but unable to perceive its actual contours, his suspicions leading him only to conventional remedies for conventional problems, completely unaware that the situation unfolding under his roof was far more disturbing than anything his worldview allowed him to imagine. The situation at Riverside Plantation reached a catastrophic turning point in August 1847, a development that remained hidden in medical archives until 2015, when a researcher examining the papers of Dr. Cornelius Hadley, a prominent Charleston physician, discovered records that documented Margaret Ashford's visit to his practice on August 12th of that year. The medical notes, written in the careful Latin and euphemistic English that physicians of the era employed when recording delicate matters, confirmed that Margaret was approximately 3 months pregnant and that the examination had been marked by what Dr. Hadley described as considerable agitation on the part of the patient, who presented with nervous symptoms and made oblique reference to unusual domestic circumstances of a troubling nature. The doctor's notes reveal that Margaret had traveled to Charleston without her husband's knowledge, staying with her sister and seeking medical consultation in a state of evident distress, though the exact nature of her revelations to Dr. Hadley remained obscured by his professional discretion and the coded language of medical record-keeping. One particularly significant notation stated that the patient had expressed grave concerns regarding the presumed paternity of the child and the impossibility of her situation, language that suggested Margaret had confided something of the truth to the physician, who responded with what his notes describe as counsel regarding the necessity of discretion and the advisement that certain matters are best left unspoken for the preservation of all concerned. The medical records indicate that Dr. Hadley prescribed laudanum for Margaret's nerves and urged her to return to her husband's home, noting in his final entry that the patient departed in a state of resignation, having accepted that her circumstances, however irregularly arrived at, must now be managed through conventional channels. The pregnancy transformed an already horrific situation into one of existential crisis, as the physical evidence of what had occurred would soon become impossible to conceal. The mounting horror of Samuel's situation reached a breaking point in early September 1847, documented through a reward notice that appeared in the Augusta Chronicle on September 8th and was preserved in the newspaper's archives, now digitized and accessible to researchers studying the antebellum period. The notice, placed by Thomas Ashford and offering a reward of $50 for information leading to the capture and return of an escaped slave, described Samuel as a mulatto boy of 15 years, approximately 5 feet 6 inches in height, of slender build, answers to the name Samuel, last seen wearing brown homespun trousers and a white cotton shirt. The language of the notice characterized Samuel as previously docile and obedient, showing no prior inclination toward flight or disobedience, making his sudden departure all the more puzzling to his master. This phrasing, typical of runaway advertisements that sought to present enslaved people as content in their bondage until corrupted by outside agitators, takes on deeply sinister meaning when examined in the context of what Samuel had endured throughout the spring and summer months. The notice went on to warn that Samuel might attempt to pass as free and seek passage on riverboats heading north, offering the substantial reward to encourage vigilance among slave catchers, river patrols, and ordinary citizens who profited from the capture of runaways. What the notice could not convey, and what Thomas Ashford himself may not have fully understood, was that Samuel's flight represented not criminal behavior, but a desperate attempt at self-preservation, the actions of a young man who had finally concluded that the risks of escape, however terrible, were preferable to remaining in a situation that was destroying him by degrees. The notice circulated throughout Georgia and into South Carolina, setting in motion the machinery of capture that would seal Samuel's fate within a matter of weeks. Samuel's freedom lasted barely 3 weeks before the system designed to prevent such escapes accomplished its purpose, a conclusion documented in the Richmond County Court records from October 2, 1847, which noted the capture of a runaway slave, matching the description in Thomas Ashford's reward notice. The court ledger, discovered by researchers in the 1980s and now housed in the Georgia State Archives, recorded that Samuel had been apprehended by a slave patrol near the Augusta docks, where he had apparently been seeking employment on a riverboat heading north toward the free states. The brief entry in the ledger stated that the captured individual had been positively identified as the property of Thomas Ashford of Burke County, and that arrangements had been made for his return to Riverside Plantation, with the $50 reward paid to the patrol members who had effected the capture. However, a notation in the margin of the ledger, written in a different hand and apparently added after the main entry, contains a cryptic reference that has puzzled historians since its discovery. Unusual circumstances, discussed in private consultation with the owner, matters too delicate for public record, but deemed relevant to the disposition of the case. This notation suggests that something occurred during the proceedings that deviated from the routine processing of captured runaways, perhaps an attempt by Samuel to explain the reasons for his flight, words spoken in desperation to officials who had the power to intervene, but who ultimately chose to return him to his master's custody. Court records indicate that Thomas Ashford traveled to Augusta personally to reclaim his property, an unusual step for a man of his standing, who typically delegated such tasks to overseers, suggesting that the unusual circumstances mentioned in the notation had reached his ears and required his direct attention. Whatever was discussed in that private consultation remained sealed by the discretion of men who understood that certain truths threatened the entire social order they existed to protect. The consequences of Samuel's attempted escape were recorded in the cold language of plantation accounting, discovered in 1982, when historians examining estate papers from Burke County uncovered an inventory list and expenditure record from Riverside Plantation dated October 1847. Among entries for seed purchases, equipment repairs, and routine medical supplies appeared a payment of $3 to Dr. Benjamin Morton for treatment of severe lacerations on male slave, age 15, following correction for attempted flight. Cross-referencing this entry with other documents, including the court records from Augusta and the timeline established through Margaret's medical records and the housekeeper's ledger, researchers concluded with virtual certainty that this referred to Samuel, who had been subjected to brutal punishment immediately upon his return to the plantation. The standard penalty for attempted escape in Burke County, as documented in numerous plantation records and overseer diaries from the period, typically consisted of between 30 and 50 lashes delivered with a leather whip, a punishment designed not merely to cause pain, but to create lasting scars that would mark the individual as a runaway and serve as warning to others who might contemplate flight. However, the notation that medical intervention was required suggests that Samuel's punishment may have exceeded even these horrific norms, the severity perhaps reflecting Thomas Ashford's rage at the embarrassment of having a previously obedient house servant attempt escape, or perhaps stemming from darker suspicions that he could not fully articulate, but that fueled his fury nonetheless. Most disturbing of all was a detail that emerged from Rachel's diary fragments, which included an entry stating that the mistress was made to watch while they tore his back to pieces in the yard, and she stood pale as death but did not turn away, and afterwards she was taken to her chambers and has not been seen since. This forced witnessing represented its own form of torture, compelling Margaret to observe the physical consequences of a situation she had created while maintaining the fiction that Samuel alone bore responsibility for the transgressions. The aftermath of Samuel's punishment and return to Riverside saw Margaret herself become a prisoner within the plantation's walls, a development documented through correspondence between Thomas Ashford and his brother William, a cotton broker in Savannah, discovered in a private collection that was donated to the Georgia Historical Society in 1991. The letters, written between November 1847 and January 1848, reveal Thomas grappling with what he termed a delicate family matter of the utmost sensitivity, while remaining maddeningly vague about the specific nature of the crisis that had engulfed his household. In a letter dated November 14th, Thomas wrote that Margaret had been confined to her chambers under the care of a nurse brought in from Augusta, suffering from what he described as a severe nervous affliction brought on by the strain of plantation life and certain unfortunate incidents that have disturbed the peace of our home. The letter made clear that Margaret was not permitted to leave her rooms or receive visitors beyond immediate family, and that Thomas had cancelled all social engagements for the foreseeable future, citing his wife's delicate health as explanation to their circle of planter society. A subsequent letter from December revealed Thomas's growing desperation to maintain appearances while managing a situation that threatened to explode into public scandal, as he wrote that the matter requires absolute discretion, for if certain details were to become known beyond these walls, the consequences for our family's standing would be catastrophic, and yet I find myself navigating waters I scarcely understand. The correspondence suggests that Thomas had pieced together enough of the truth to recognize that something deeply wrong had occurred involving his wife and one of the enslaved people of his household. But his letters reveal a man more concerned with preventing scandal than with examining the moral dimensions of what had transpired under his authority. The birth that concluded Margaret's pregnancy occurred in March 1848, documented in a midwife's account book discovered at a Savannah estate sale in 1995, a leather-bound volume that recorded the professional services of Mrs. Henrietta Blackwood, who attended births throughout Burke and neighbouring counties during the antebellum period. The entry for March 23, 1848, noted services rendered to Mrs. Margaret Ashford at Riverside Plantation, with payment of $20 received from Thomas Ashford for attendance at childbirth and related necessities. Language that adhered to the standard format Mrs. Blackwood used for dozens of similar entries throughout her career. However, this particular entry contained an unusual addendum written in smaller script beneath the main notation, stating that infant removed from premises immediately upon birth by arrangement with the father, destination undisclosed to attending midwife, mother sedated following delivery. This cryptic addition suggested extraordinary circumstances surrounding the birth, a deviation from normal practice where mothers typically remained with their newborns for at least several days of recovery and initial nursing. The account book provided no information about the infant's sex, health, or appearance, details that Mrs. Blackwood routinely recorded in other entries, suggesting either that she had been instructed to maintain minimal documentation or that she had chosen discretion regarding a situation she recognized as deeply irregular. Cross-referencing the date with other historical records reveals that this birth occurred exactly 8 months after Margaret's visit to Dr. Hadley in Charleston, a timeline that would have made concealing the circumstances of conception impossible for anyone with knowledge of both the pregnancy's beginning and its conclusion. The immediate removal of the infant represented Thomas Ashford's solution to an impossible problem. A child whose existence threatened to expose secrets that he would go to any lengths to suppress, whose very presence in the household would serve as permanent evidence of transgressions that respectable society could never acknowledge. Samuel's final disappearance from the historical record came in April 1848, documented through a bill of sale discovered among Thomas Ashford's plantation papers, a transaction that represented both punishment and permanent erasure of the living evidence of what had occurred at Riverside. The document, dated April 8, 1848, recorded the sale of one male slave named Samuel, age 16 years, mulatto, literate, skilled in household service, to Jacob Morrison, a slave trader based in Augusta who specialized in supplying labor to the expanding cotton plantations of the Mississippi Delta and the brutal sugar estates of Louisiana. The sale price of $600 was notably below market value for a healthy young male slave with household training, suggesting that Thomas was motivated less by profit than by the urgent need to remove Samuel from Georgia entirely, to place him so far beyond reach that he could never return, never speak, never serve as a reminder of the darkness that had invaded the Ashford household. Sale to a Deep South trader was widely understood among enslaved people as a fate approaching death itself, a descent into labor conditions so brutal that survival rates were significantly lower than in the Upper South, where cotton cultivation, while harsh, did not approach the lethal intensity of the sugar harvest or the malarial swamps of the Delta region. Rachel's diary fragments contain a final entry from April 1848 that simply states, "They took Samuel away in chains today, sold him down the river like he was the guilty one, and nobody will ever know what really happened except us who were here, and we can never tell." Despite extensive searches through plantation records, slave trader documents, and estate papers from Mississippi and Louisiana, no further documentation of Samuel's life or death has ever been located, his fate joining the millions of stories lost to the deliberate obscurity that slavery imposed on those it consumed. The final chapter of this disturbing case unfolded across several years, and ultimately across more than a century, as the principal figures met their fates and the truth remained buried until historians accidentally uncovered the evidence that had been hidden in attics and archives. Margaret Ashford never returned to Riverside Plantation after the birth in March 1848, instead being transported in May of that year to Belmont Sanatorium, a private institution in the Virginia countryside, that catered to wealthy families seeking discreet care for relatives suffering from mental afflictions or whose presence had become socially inconvenient. Records from Belmont, discovered during research into 19th-century psychiatric institutions, show that Margaret remained there under the care of physicians who treated her with the standard remedies of the era until her death on November 3rd, 1852, at the age of 33, the cause listed simply as decline of vital powers. The fate of the infant born at Riverside remained one of the enduring mysteries of the case, though researchers have uncovered tantalizing hints in the baptismal records of St. Francis Catholic Church in Mobile, Alabama, which show a child of uncertain parentage placed with a merchant family named Delaney in April 1848, the timing and circumstances suggesting a possible connection, though definitive proof has never been established. Thomas Ashford himself lived until 1869, remarrying in 1850 to a widow from Savannah and maintaining his position in Burke County society until his death, his reputation never publicly tarnished by the events of 1847 and 1848. The truth only began to emerge in 1943, when that graduate student discovered the trunk containing Margaret's journal, the housekeeper's ledger, and the letters that finally provided a window into the horror that had unfolded at Riverside, leading to decades of subsequent research that uncovered Rachel's diary, the medical records, and all the other fragments that allowed historians to piece together this devastating story. The case raises profound questions about how many similar stories remain buried in the unexplored archives of the antebellum South. How many lives were destroyed in silence behind plantation walls, where absolute power enabled atrocities that were not aberrations, but inevitable consequences of a system that treated human beings as property.